Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy for Zimperium, and we'd like to welcome you to another webinar on the 7 deadly sins that CISOs need to know when it comes to the mobility side of things and mobile security. And this is, of course, the fact that mobile security is the new frontier, and mobile attacks are the new frontier for the hackers, et cetera. And so we've been producing the series around the 7 deadly sins that CISOs need to know about mobile security as they're coming up the curve. Today, it's going to be all about allowing mobile to deliver ransomware. And this is a fascinating one for me, and one that I think is critical to the understanding of how somebody can use a mobile device to pivot inside the enterprise to create chaos. Before we dive into it, usual perfunctory stuff. We will have a Q&A session at the end. I try to keep these to about 20, 25 minutes max of content so that you guys can get back to your life, try and pack it in. If we have questions, great. If we don't, that's fine too. We will give you that time back. Please don't use the chat capability because we've had some trouble with it. So even if you have technical issues or questions, please just drop that in the Q&A. The archive version of the webinar will be up within a day or so on our site. And we can provide the slides to anybody who's interested. So with that, let us dive into the deadly sin of allowing mobile devices to deliver ransomware into your enterprise. Before we begin, I want to level set on 2 things. One is going to be on the next slide, but this one I think is really important. If you ask any security professional since the beginning of time, what is the biggest risk in my organization? The answer has always been the same. The answer is a carbon-based life form. Human beings make really, really, really bad decisions. Now, those people have been making those bad decisions inside of billions of dollars of network security, firewalls, DMZs, everything else, on centrally managed, centrally secured desktops and laptops that spend the vast majority of their time inside of those protected walls, centralized patch management systems, all the rest of that fun stuff. Now, in mobile, that same person, that user, is the admin of a mobile device. They're the ones who decide what networks they're going to connect to. They decide if they're going to update or not. There's no patch management system. And by the way, a lot of times they say, no, I'm not going to update because it might impact my battery or it might slow my phone down or whatever. They decide what apps they're going to install. And oh, by the way, they spend 80% of their time outside of the protected corporate network. So now you've got this supercomputer that's got access to all the same resources, all the same capabilities, but the user is the admin. So it's critical as we start going through this that we constantly keep in mind, the user's the admin. How are we going to defend ourselves from this person who is my biggest risk, now making all these decisions outside of all of my standard investments? So that's level set number 1. Level set number 2 is this one, because a lot of people will ask this question. 100% of our customers detect mobile threats. We're going to go into it. We're going to talk about the type here a little bit, how it pivots into the ransomware side of things. But 100% of our customers detect threats. So the threat is very, very real. A key component now, and this a couple of years ago, especially on the security side, they didn't want to believe this. But now we've seen a real shift over the last couple of years. Gartner's even talked about it. Security folks are now driving all of the mobile security purchases, whereas beforehand, it was the mobility side of the house. And the security guys were kind of like, yeah, there's no threats. I don't have to worry about it, blah, 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 blah. Right? Now everyone's basically saying, look, an endpoint's an endpoint's an endpoint. If I've got patient data sitting on a laptop, it's the same as if I got patient data sitting on a tablet. If I've got to protect it in one, I've got to protect it in the other. But here's the interesting thing. I mentioned that billions of dollars of investment, centralized solutions, et cetera, et cetera. Our current endpoint security on laptops and desktops, according to all the current studies, represent 40% of the endpoints that are accessing our enterprise resources. That's where we have visibility, which means from an endpoint security standpoint, in most instances, unless you've deployed a mobile security solution, you have no visibility into 60% of the endpoints that are accessing your enterprise. So there's some time-tested rules in security, time-tested laws in security. One of them is land and expand. The bad guys are now always going to find the weakest link, the easiest path to enter an enterprise. And guess what? Devices that spend 80% of the time outside of the enterprise, that are in the hands of a user who's making really bad decisions and have no security on them, but then walk right back into the enterprise or email right back into the enterprise, are the perfect targets. So that is why this is a very real issue. So I think it's important to baseline the different types of attacks. It's critical, especially as we come back to how do we solve this. There are 4 primary attacks on mobile devices, big buckets, right? One of the main differences between mobile and traditional is that all apps are in containers in mobile. That means, unlike the traditional world that I came from, and I'm sure a lot of folks on the call came from, in the traditional world, Windows and everything, an app could come in and it could go sideways like wildfire through a bunch of other apps. You can't do that in mobile. Malicious apps can still be delivered, an ability to deliver an exploit or some other attack, but by themselves, malicious apps are really untargeted. It's all about fraud. And now, Zimperium is built from the very beginning to protect enterprises. So our very first thought, our thought has always been, how do we protect enterprises? If we go all the way to the left over there, I mentioned one time-tested rule is land and expand. Bad guys are running a business. They're not going to try and break into the hardest place. They're going to use the easiest way in. The second law that still is time-tested in cybersecurity is persistence. If the bad guys take the time to compromise any computing resource, server, database, laptop, desktop, point-of-sale terminal, doesn't need a SCADA system, doesn't even matter. If they're going to take the time to do it, they want to remain persistent on that device as long as humanly possible. Again, just keep thinking of these guys as running a business. They have an ROI that they're trying to hit. They maximize their ROI by increasing the return by staying persistent as long as possible. Well, the only way to be persistent, the only way to weaponize a mobile device in any way, shape, or form is you have to actually compromise the device. If you just stay, for instance, in a malicious app, all you can do is play around inside your own little Applo shell. The objective, in order to be persistent, in order to truly be able to work across all the containers and all the capabilities of the device, is you need to compromise the device. You need to elevate privileges in some way, shape, or form, take over the device. So for a business, which is what we are trying to help protect, malicious apps are untargeted, not the real threat. And I'll tell you why in a second. Phishing becomes a little bit more dangerous because the minute that browser gets processed, it can actually deliver an exploit much easier than having to break out of a container, for instance, on the malicious app side. And 90% of breaches start with a phishing attack, and 2/3 of emails are read on mobile. So, and it's much easier to phish somebody on mobile because of the form factor, the size of the screen, everything like that. But still, as a general rule, it's still untargeted. They're phishing with major brands and everything on those lines. I mentioned that the bad guys are bad dudes, but they're very good at what they do from a business standpoint. And they're very focused on metrics, just like the rest of us, including ROIs. If they are targeting XYZ company, they are not going to drop an app in the App Store and pray somebody from XYZ downloads it. What they're going to do is they're going to set up a man in the middle of fake Wi-Fi network right across the office from XYZ and wait until somebody from XYZ connects to it, thinking it's the safe network of the coffee shop or whatever, and then deliver an exploit immediately. Very efficient. We've been doing this for years and years and years, cross industries. I've been doing it we've done slice and dices by everything from legal to federal to it's very consistent. 90% of targeted attacks start with a network attack, which means 9 times out of 10, an attack against an enterprise, which is all we care about protecting right now at Zimperium, the bad guy owns the network. So we're going to come back to that, but it's important to know these kind of different attack vectors, and it's also important to know The key objective is, in order to weaponize this device, you need to actually compromise it and take it over. So we're here to talk about ransomware. How can mobile devices deliver ransomware? And specifically, the ransomware we're talking about now is the traditional ransomware that we all think about, Wannacry, for instance, right? Eventually, there could be different types of ransomware that are a different set of problems. Like there's already been a bunch of things around air conditioners, HVACs, where all of a sudden it's 105 degrees in Dallas, Texas, which is where we're headquartered here at Zimperium, and somebody decides they're gonna hold the HVACs ransom. You know, people are gonna start paying for it. But today we're just gonna be talking about things like the Wannacries. We did a webinar just a little while back that's related to this whole thing, which was, what are the top 5 reasons that hackers want your devices? The primary goals that these guys were gunning for, just like they are in a lot of places, credentials. We want to steal credentials directly, then we can reuse them, data, of course, and then to weaponize the device itself. By the way, some of you probably have seen the coverage of Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, his phone being hacked. And it's interesting because the only stuff that's come out so far has been some of his personal data, very personal data. But there's no way of somebody taking over a device like that, especially with somebody of Mr. Bezos's, stature, that the data didn't pull down enterprise data as well. So it's going to be real interesting to see what happens. But this weaponization part is key, because again, if I want to be persistent, if I want to continue expanding further into the enterprise and use this as my point that I'm landing on, but I'm going to expand from because it's easy, because the users are the admin, that's the key part, particularly as it pertains to the topic of today, which is delivering ransomware. So like we said, one of the main objectives is to deliver ransomware. And we're going to dive into a couple different approaches that we've seen, some of which include spearfishing and some things on those lines. That is definitely one of the reasons that the hackers want your employees' phones. So what are the main ways? There's multiple, but for clarity and kind of brevity, we broke it down into 3. There's the pivot. I'm going to go into each one. There's the sniff, and there's the spearfish. Okay, those are the kind of 3 that we've already seen, 3 examples that we've already seen, and I'm going to go kind of run through each one of them just to show this is a very real issue. And again, constantly keep in your mind, somebody has compromised a device. If I compromise a device, if I'm a hacker and I compromise a device, we used to say, oh, we've got as much control as the user. But then we realized that wasn't being accurate. Because when you compromise a device, especially as we do in all our demos, which anybody's interested, we'll do a demo for you, we actually have more control over that phone, that smart device, than the user does. Way more, because we have root access. We can see, we have all the keys, we have everything. So let's go through number 1, the pivot. We actually also did a webinar. If you want to go back for details on this, it's a, kind of corporate network get hacked. There was a pen tester that was hired by a financial firm in Europe. And the whole thing was, we want you to exfiltrate some data. The only thing we want is we want you to start with an employee. That's it. So of course, the first thing they did was they phished him, had nothing to do with mobile. They did a phishing campaign. Well, just so happened that the company had done a phishing awareness campaign the week beforehand, so that failed miserably. So what they did though was they noticed when they were in there that there was more devices connected to the guest network in the lobby than there were people in the lobby. So they very quickly ascertained there's a bunch of corporate people that are using the lobby network because it probably has less restrictions than the regular one. The receptionist was there, and they're talking to the receptionist. They end up tricking her into installing an app, a game for her daughter who needed it to kind of help calm herself down. Once they did that, they were able to then pivot off of that guest network, because now they were on that network, being able to use her phone as a conduit, found a vulnerable server, and eventually made their way all the way into ultimately having complete admin privileges across the board. So not even just exfiltrating data, they actually had complete admin privileges, what they call the golden ticket. So in that case, they are now being able to leverage that device inside the network. And then once you're inside the network, in this case, they were just going through the exercise to prove that they could continue to get access. But any of those devices that they touched, they could have delivered ransomware to. So using the phone when it walks into the network and is connected to the corporate network as a pivot point is one approach. The second approach is what we call the Sniff. And we've seen a lot of malware, and I'll even talk about some specific folks here in a quick second. We've seen a lot of particularly Android malware that the very first thing it does when it's on a phone, when it connects to a new Wi-Fi network, it will scan all the devices on that network, hence the reason we're saying sniff, it's sniffing around, to find any of those devices that are susceptible to ransomware, such as Wannacry. And for instance, the folks behind Wannacry, the Lazarus group, they are now doing a ton of Android malware. So the fact that we've got some of the guys that are authors of some of that ransomware that are now developing things for mobile just continues to reinforce the fact that this is a way that these guys are doing it. So the first one, where we actually pivoted, we had that device, we came in, and then we started pivoting to other different parts of the network itself, the broad corporate network. This one is, as soon as I get on a Wi-Fi, I'm going to sniff around, I'm going to find somebody who's susceptible, bam, deliver it, right? So there was the pivot, there was the sniff, and then there's the Spearfish. And we've got a whole demo where we show, once we compromise the device, one of the things you can do is you can send texts, you can send emails, and it is actually coming from that person for all intents and purposes. So the demo that we did, a couple of webinars, for instance, where you said the risks of the 7 deadly sins of not protecting corporate email, we showed how you could send a Spearfish in that case saying, hey, send me the financial reports, will you? You know, think about it, if you're a bad guy, I mean, you know, if you get the access to the earnings reports before it comes out, you could probably do something with that information, right? But the mere fact that they were delivering an email from this person's device, they could also deliver ransomware in that email. That was, like I said, it was about, in the example a couple of weeks ago, was pulling data out, back and forth, et cetera. In this case, you could deliver it straight in there and literally spearfish somebody directly. So those are 3 big ways that if I have this device, I could take advantage of the fact that it's walking into the corporate network. I could take advantage of the Wi-Fi's it's connecting to. I could take advantage of the fact that I can send emails as that person to be opened by somebody on a device that's susceptible to ransomware. Then, of course, there's the logical question. Well, what do you do about it? And these webinars are never intended to hammer anybody over the head with the product, you know, but hopefully there's a bit of an answer to this whole thing, right? It's important to cycle back to this thing. 90% of targeted attacks start with the bad guys owning the network. That's why from the very beginning, since we're trying to protect enterprises and we know that the bad guys are going to maintain a persistent foothold, they're going to weaponize this to do all the things I was just talking about, for instance. We said, okay, what's the fastest way to do that? It is the network. And so therefore, since the bad guy owns the network 9 times out of 10, we've always started from the very beginning and said you have to do all of your detection on device. Now, the experts are catching up to that. So even Gartner here is saying, and this is about as strong of a word as you're going to get from Gartner, you know, that an on-device agent provides a better likelihood of the protection persisting over a compromised network. When we actually talk to them behind the scenes, it's much stronger terminology in terms of abilities to detect. Because why? Because if I'm the bad guy, if I control the network, if you're doing all your detection in the cloud, the first thing I'm going to do is cut off any access to the cloud, any access to a detection size, which means machine speed attacks need to have machine speed responses. The only way to do that is if you're doing 100% of your detection on device, which is what we do. We have one core engine, it's called Z9. Z9 detects all device network phishing malicious app attacks, known and unknown, using machine learning that's trained up in the lab and then deployed down onto the endpoints to detect these attacks in real time. Z9 can be deployed out in 1 or 2 ways. If you're trying to protect your employees, their devices, their data, 100% of the time, use a product called ZIP, stands for Z Intrusion Prevention System. It's basically next generation antivirus, next generation endpoint protection, whatever term you want to use, for mobile. If, however, you have a mobile app and you need to protect yourself against maybe consumer devices that you don't own, but you need to protect your app in the session that that app is having, we have an SDK called ZApp for in-app protection, where you can literally drop the protection directly in your app. In that case, you're detecting all the same attacks, but you're actually deciding, what am I going to do with that as a function of this session? Because I'm not protecting the device, I'm protecting the session, right? So we have examples, but one major financial institution is the easy one for me to use because it covers the landscape. So they selected Zips to protect a couple 100,000 of their employees 100% of the time. But they also use the SDK to protect multiple apps that they have to protect millions of mobile banking users, and also a bunch of internal apps for BYOD and some things on those lines where they didn't want to go the full approach. Both of these come into our console. Another huge advantage, in addition to the fact we can survive a man-in-the-middle attack of doing all our detection on device, we're completely cloud agnostic. Folks that are doing cloud-based detection have locked their console into only one service. We don't care. We believe fundamentally that we need to fit into the enterprise, not have the enterprise fit into us. So whatever people's cloud choices are, we don't care. You can put our console. Whatever your EMM choices are, we don't care. We can also handle multiple EMMs in a single tenant. So if somebody's going from one provider to another provider, that's okay. You can have them both in here. You don't have to slow down having the detection. The easy analogy is we're the smoke detector, they're the sprinkler system. So a lot of our remediation comes through existing EMMs that are already agents on individual people's devices. Behind Z Console, we talk a lot about risks and threats. Applications bring a ton of risk. So there's malicious apps that are being detected by Z9, but there's also other apps in your environment that are legitimate apps, but because they're put together like a bunch of Legos with libraries from all over the place, sometimes on purpose, sometimes inadvertently, those apps have huge privacy and security risks in them. Some of them are unencrypting traffic. Some of them are sending traffic to a foreign country. Some of them are providing access that they really don't need to cameras, contacts, calendar, etc. So we identify that with what's called advanced app analysis, Z3A, is one of the best app risk assessment capabilities that's part of this whole offering. And then we provide incredible forensics on all these attacks down into SIM solutions. We also have integrated our agent directly into the Mobile Iron EMM agent. So if you're a Mobile Iron customer, you can actually get our technology directly inside a Mobile Iron. And we've also done relationships with some of the other folks to power their solutions as well. So with that, I will stop and see if we have any other questions, but I thank you all very much for giving us some of your time. Okay, I do not see any questions, but I do want to thank you all again. The archive version will be up soon, and I hope you all have a great day and got some value out of this webinar. Thanks again.